Rain fell so hard it flattened the rubber trees. On August 18, 1966, 108 Australian soldiers moved through a plantation near the village of Long Tan in South Vietnam. They were not looking for a major battle. They were following signs of enemy movement after a mortar attack on their base. Within an hour, they were surrounded. Estimates would later say 1,500. Some would say 2,000, others more. What is not debated is this: one company stood in open ground, in monsoon rain, and did not break. This is the story of how that happened. When most people think of the Vietnam War, they picture American helicopters and jungle firefights. Fewer picture Australian troops moving quietly through thick brush in Phuoc Tuy province. But Australia was there early. In the early 1960s, leaders in Canberra believed that communism spreading through Southeast Asia could threaten nearby countries. The domino theory was not just American language. Australian officials feared that if South Vietnam fell, other nations in the region might follow. Australia was also bound by treaty. Through the ANZUS alliance with the United States and New Zealand, security commitments were not just political statements. They carried weight. In 1965, Australia began deploying combat forces to South Vietnam. At first, units were attached to American formations, but by 1966, Australia wanted operational control of its own sector. That led to the establishment of the first Australian task force, commonly called 1ATF. The task force set up base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province. It was a bold decision. Instead of operating from a large American base, the Australians carved out their own position in territory known to contain strong Viet Cong influence. Their doctrine differed from the American approach. U.S. forces often relied on large-scale search and destroy missions, helicopter assaults, heavy firepower, high mobility. The Australians emphasized something else. They focused on patrol dominance. Small units moved through villages and jungle trails. They aimed to disrupt enemy networks, gather intelligence, and separate guerrillas from the local population. It required patience, it required discipline, and it required confidence in small unit leadership. By mid-1966, 1ATF was settling into its role. The surrounding villages had been cleared to create a security buffer around Nui Dat. Barbed wire and artillery guns marked the perimeter. Patrols fanned out daily. The enemy watched. Phuoc Tuy province was not empty jungle. It was contested ground. The Viet Cong had long-standing networks in the area. North Vietnamese army units were also operating nearby. The stage was set for a confrontation. 2 days before the battle at Long Tan, Nui Dat came under mortar attack. Dozens of rounds landed inside the base perimeter. It was a direct challenge. The response would be immediate. Patrols were sent out to locate the mortar teams responsible. One of those patrols belonged to D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Within 48 hours, that company would walk into one of the most intense small unit battles of the entire war, and they would do it with 108 men. Nui Dat was chosen for one reason above all others: control. It sat on slightly raised ground in Phuoc Tuy province, surrounded by rubber plantations, jungle, and small farming villages. From that position, the 1st Australian Task Force could project power outward instead of reacting inward. But planting a base in contested territory meant drawing a line in someone else's backyard. To secure the area, thousands of civilians from the nearby village of Long Tan were relocated. The Australians cleared vegetation, laid barbed wire, dug defensive pits, and positioned artillery to cover all approaches. Nui Dat was no temporary forward camp. It was a permanent footprint. The strategy behind it was deliberate. Unlike the Americans, the Australians relied on small patrols instead of large sweep operations. Move often, stay light, maintain constant pressure. The goal was not to destroy the enemy in one massive clash. It was to disrupt him daily. That approach required discipline and confidence in junior leaders. Platoons would patrol through plantations and jungle with limited vehicle support. Contact could happen anywhere, at close range, and without warning. Phuoc Tuy province was not empty space. The Viet Cong had long-standing networks in the region. Intelligence later indicated that the 275th Regiment operated nearby. North Vietnamese army units were also present in the province. Supply routes ran through plantations and narrow tracks known best by locals. The Australians understood they were being watched. Then, on the night of August 16th and 17th, 1966, mortar rounds struck Nui Dat. The attack was short but precise. Dozens of shells landed inside the perimeter. Equipment was damaged. Several men were wounded. The firing position was outside immediate artillery retaliation range, and the attackers withdrew quickly. It was not a probing shot. It was a statement. Someone close by had both the capability and the confidence to hit the base directly. The task force commander ordered aggressive patrols to find the source of the attack. Tracks were discovered east of the base. Signs pointed toward the rubber plantations near Long Tan. On the morning of August 18th, patrols moved out under heavy skies. Among them was D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Their mission was straightforward: locate the enemy mortar force. They would soon discover they had walked into something much larger. D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was not a large formation. It was a rifle company built around 3 rifle platoons and a company headquarters element. On paper, it was 108 men. In reality, it was a mix of seasoned non-commissioned officers and young soldiers barely into adulthood. Some had trained for jungle warfare in Malaysia. Others were new to combat. All had drilled the same fundamentals: spacing, fire discipline, movement under contact, and trust in the chain of command. The company commander was Major Harry Smith. Smith was methodical and calm. He believed in controlling a fight through communication and artillery coordination rather than reckless maneuver. That mindset would matter later. Each platoon carried standard Australian infantry weapons of the time. The L1A1 self-loading rifle was the primary weapon, chambered in 7.62 NATO. Machine gun teams carried the M60. Radio operators managed bulky sets that were reliable but heavy and sensitive to water. Artillery support was central to Australian doctrine. From Nui Dat, batteries stood ready to fire in support of patrols. Observers trained to call in accurate fire missions under pressure. The expectation was clear: if a patrol made contact, artillery would respond quickly and precisely. On August 18, 1966, D Company moved out in response to signs of enemy activity east of the base. Earlier patrols had discovered fresh tracks and evidence of recent movement. The mortar attack on Nui Dat 2 nights before had sharpened everyone's focus. The terrain ahead was a rubber plantation. Rubber trees grow in rows, evenly spaced, with limited undergrowth beneath them. Visibility is better than in dense jungle, but cover is limited. Movement is exposed. Sound travels. As D Company advanced, the weather shifted. The air grew heavier. Clouds thickened overhead. Shortly after 3 p.m., one of the forward platoons made contact with a small group of enemy soldiers. Shots were exchanged. The enemy withdrew. It could have ended there. Instead, the firing intensified. Reports came in of movement on multiple flanks. Enemy forces were not just present, they were maneuvering. Within minutes, it became clear that D Company had not found a small mortar team. They had stepped into the path of a much larger force moving toward Nui Dat, and they were alone in the plantation. The first shots did not sound unusual. Short bursts, controlled fire, the kind of exchange that happens when a patrol bumps into a small enemy element. D Company had trained for that. A quick engagement, the enemy breaks contact, the patrol regroups. But this time, the firing did not fade. Instead, it spread. Shortly after 3 p.m. on August 18, 1966, 11 Platoon made initial contact in the rubber plantation east of Nui Dat. They reported several enemy moving across their front. When the Australians fired, the enemy withdrew into the trees. Moments later, more movement appeared, then more gunfire. The shots came faster. Automatic weapons opened up. Rounds cracked past tree trunks and snapped overhead. The sound was coming from multiple directions. This was no small probing party. Major Harry Smith ordered 10 platoon forward to support 11 platoon. The terrain made maneuver difficult. The rubber trees were evenly spaced, but the ground between them offered little cover beyond shallow depressions and tree bases. Then the rain began. A heavy monsoon downpour swept across the plantation. Visibility dropped, radios hissed with static, rifles became slick in the hand. The enemy fire increased. Machine gun bursts tore through the trees. Mortar rounds began landing nearby. D Company was now receiving fire from the front and flanks. Reports suggested enemy elements were moving to cut off withdrawal routes. Smith quickly realized what was happening. D Company had not stumbled onto a small force. They had intersected with a larger unit, likely elements of the Viet Cong 275th Regiment, possibly reinforced by North Vietnamese troops. Intelligence later suggested a force numbering in the thousands was operating in the area. In the plantation, numbers did not matter in theory. In practice, they did. The Australians were spread across open ground, separated by platoon intervals. As enemy pressure increased, 11 platoon became isolated. Casualties began to mount. Requests for ammunition came over the radio. Smith faced a crucial decision: withdraw toward Nui Dat or hold the ground and consolidate. With the enemy pressing hard and movement under fire becoming more dangerous by the minute, he chose to hold and coordinate supporting fire. Artillery would have to keep them alive. D Company tightened its defensive posture among the rubber trees. Platoons adjusted arcs of fire. Machine guns were repositioned. Wounded men were dragged behind trunks for cover. The rain fell harder. Enemy forces advanced in waves, using the storm for concealment. At times, they came within close range before being driven back by rifle and machine gun fire. The fight had shifted. This was no longer a patrol action. It was a defensive battle in open ground against a force that appeared to be closing from all sides, and daylight was fading. By late afternoon, D Company was no longer maneuvering. They were surviving. The rain came down in sheets, turning the plantation floor into mud. Water ran off helmets and pooled in shallow depressions around tree trunks. Radios crackled through static. Voices were clipped, controlled, and steady. But the situation was tightening. 11 Platoon had taken the brunt of the early contact. Casualties were mounting. Some sections were down to only a few men still firing. Requests for ammunition became urgent. Enemy movement was reported on multiple flanks. Major Harry Smith pulled the company into a tighter defensive position. Platoons adjusted inward, shortening the perimeter. The formation was no longer a patrol spread across terrain. It was a shrinking circle of rifles and machine guns. The enemy pressed closer. Automatic fire cut through the rows of rubber trees. Mortar rounds landed nearby, showering mud and bark into the air. At times, attackers advanced in groups, moving through the rain toward the Australian lines. They were met with disciplined, controlled fire. The Australians did not waste ammunition. That mattered. By this stage of the fight, resupply was uncertain. Each man carried only what he had stepped off with that morning. There were no vehicles in the plantation, no armored protection, no air support breaking through the storm. Just rifles, machine guns, and artillery in the distance. Smith stayed on the radio with Nui Dat, coordinating fire missions. The guns at the base began firing increasingly close to D Company's position. Shells landed just beyond the perimeter, then closer still. Danger close artillery is not a phrase used lightly. Each adjustment had to be exact. Too short and the rounds would fall on Australian positions. Too far and the enemy could regroup. The rain made observation harder. Smoke and mud blurred the edges of the fight. Still, the artillery kept coming. At several points, enemy forces appeared to be forming up for larger assaults. Waves of movement were reported through the trees. When they came forward, the combination of small arms fire and artillery broke their momentum. The perimeter held, but the cost was growing. The losses were mounting, though the final toll was not yet known. Men were hit along the line. Those who could still move pulled the wounded behind trees for cover. The only certainty was that the firing had not stopped. As daylight faded, visibility dropped further. The plantation darkened under thick cloud cover and rain. The enemy still had the advantage in numbers. What D Company had was cohesion. The line did not collapse. Sections reinforced one another. Machine gun teams shifted to cover threatened gaps. Platoon commanders kept communication moving despite interference and noise. They were surrounded, and they were still standing. By late afternoon, D Company was holding, but barely. The rain had turned the plantation into a gray blur. Smoke hung low between the rubber trees. Radio traffic cut in and out. Sections were down to thin numbers. The enemy kept probing for a break in the line. If the perimeter collapsed, there would be no second position. Major Harry Smith knew the company could not win a firefight based on numbers alone. What they had was reach. He stayed in constant contact with the guns at Nui Dat. Supporting D Company were batteries positioned at the base, including 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, equipped with 105mm howitzers. These gunners had trained for rapid response fire in support of patrols operating beyond the wire. Now that doctrine was being tested under extreme pressure. Observers called in adjustments through the storm. The guns shifted their aim. Then they fired again. Shells arced over the plantation and exploded beyond the Australian lines, throwing up mud and splintered wood. The first missions were placed ahead of the perimeter. Then the enemy shifted. Fire began landing closer. Smith ordered the artillery brought in tighter. Danger close artillery means the rounds fall so near friendly positions that even a small error can be fatal. In heavy rain, with shifting visibility and a fluid perimeter, accuracy mattered more than ever. The gunners at Nui Dat fired anyway. Battery after battery joined in. High explosive shells landed in arcs around D Company's position. The sound rolled through the plantation in waves. Detonation after detonation, breaking up forming assaults and forcing enemy units to scatter. At times, attackers advanced through the bombardment, closing distance under cover of rain and noise. When they emerged from the trees, they were met with rifle and machine gun fire. The coordination did not stop. Over the course of the battle, thousands of rounds were fired in support of D Company. Fire missions were adjusted repeatedly, sometimes landing within tens of meters of Australian positions. The margin for error was razor thin. The artillery changed the fight. Instead of being overwhelmed by mass numbers, D Company forced the engagement into controlled sectors. Enemy formations could not gather without being targeted. Momentum stalled. Still, the pressure did not disappear. As evening approached, ammunition within the company remained limited. Casualties were mounting. The perimeter was holding, but it was holding under constant strain. The guns at Nui Dat kept firing, and as long as they did, D Company still had a chance. By early evening, D Company had been under pressure for hours. The artillery had broken up assaults, the perimeter had held, but ammunition was running low. Some sections were nearly dry. Casualties were scattered around the defensive line. Light was fading under heavy cloud. At Nui Dat, commanders understood the situation was critical. A decision was made to send a relief force. The problem was weather and terrain. The monsoon rain had flooded low ground and turned tracks into mud. Visibility was poor. Movement by vehicle risked ambush. They moved anyway. Elements of the 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron mounted up in M113 armored personnel carriers. Infantry reinforcements boarded with them. Engines roared to life as rain hammered against metal hulls. The carriers pushed out from Nui Dat towards the plantation. Driving in those conditions was not simple. Tracks were slick. Visibility through vision blocks was limited. The plantation itself offered narrow lanes between rows of trees. It was not ideal ground for armored maneuver. But the M113 was built for rough terrain. As the carriers approached the sound of gunfire, artillery continued to land around D Company's perimeter. Coordination was constant. The risk of friendly fire increased as the relief force closed in. Inside the plantation, D Company's line was still intact, but strained. Enemy pressure had not stopped. Fire continued to come from multiple directions. At times, attackers appeared within close range before being driven back. The rain had not eased. Then came the sound of engines. The 1st Armored Carriers broke through toward the Australian position just as daylight was fading. Their arrival shifted the balance. The sight of armored vehicles advancing through the rain signaled that D Company was no longer isolated. Infantry dismounted and reinforced the perimeter. Firepower increased immediately. Enemy resistance began to thin. Whether due to mounting casualties, artillery disruption, or the arrival of armor, opposing forces started to disengage. Movement that had been aggressive throughout the afternoon became cautious, then sporadic. By nightfall, the firing tapered off. D Company had held its ground for hours against a numerically superior force. The relief had arrived in time. The plantation fell quiet except for rain, distant artillery, and the low hum of engines. The battle was not yet fully understood, but the line had not been broken. The rain eased sometime during the night. Darkness still covered the plantation, but the firing had stopped. D Company remained in position, reinforced by the relief force. Wounded men were treated where they lay. Radios carried quieter traffic now. Reports, casualty counts, requests for evacuation at first light. No one knew yet how large the enemy force had truly been. At dawn on August 19th, patrols moved cautiously beyond the perimeter. What they found changed how the battle would be remembered. Bodies lay scattered across the plantation floor. Some were caught in the open between tree rows. Others lay near shallow scrapes and weapon positions. Equipment had been abandoned in the retreat: rifles, machine guns, ammunition, webbing. The official Australian count recorded 245 enemy dead on the battlefield. Additional blood trails and drag marks suggested more had been removed during the night. Australian commanders later estimated total enemy casualties at 500 or more. Vietnamese accounts after the war suggested lower confirmed losses, and historians continued to debate the exact figure. What is not debated are Australian losses. 18 soldiers from D Company were killed in the battle. 24 were wounded. For a company-sized unit, the toll was severe. The names of the dead were recorded. Their positions in the line were remembered. The battlefield told a clear story. D Company had been heavily engaged, and the fight had come close. Weapons recovered indicated that elements of the Viet Cong 275th Regiment had been involved, along with the local D-445 Battalion. The plantation had not been the site of a small harassment action. It had been part of the larger movement of forces in the province. In the days that followed, media reports framed the battle as a dramatic stand against overwhelming odds. For Australia, it quickly became a defining moment of its involvement in Vietnam. But even in the early reports, questions formed. How many enemy soldiers had truly engaged D Company? How many had been positioned nearby but never directly committed? Was the encounter a planned assault on Nui Dat that collided unexpectedly with an Australian patrol? Those debates would continue for decades. On the ground that morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was that 108 men had walked into a rubber plantation and held their ground under conditions that should have broken them. The cost was counted, and Long Tan entered history. The battle ended in the plantation. The debate began afterward. In the weeks that followed, Australian commanders reported that D Company had faced a force of roughly 1,500 to 2,500 enemy troops. The official battlefield count listed 245 enemy dead. Blood trails suggested more had been removed during the night. Years later, Vietnamese sources provided different figures. Accounts acknowledged the involvement of the 275th Regiment and the local D-445 Battalion, but suggested that not all elements were fully committed to the fight. Some historians argue that several hundred enemy troops directly engaged D Company, while larger formations were operating in the area. The truth likely sits somewhere between the extremes. What is clear is that D Company faced a numerically superior force. The intensity of fire, the sustained assaults, and the volume of artillery required to stabilize the perimeter all support that conclusion. Whether the attackers numbered in the high hundreds or the low thousands, the Australians were outmatched in size. But Long Tan became more than a numbers debate. It became part of Australian military identity. For a nation with a smaller force in Vietnam compared to the United States, the battle offered a clear example of doctrine in action. Disciplined small units, coordinated artillery, and a steady leadership under pressure. Recognition, however, was not immediate or uncontested. Major Harry Smith and several of his men received decorations for their actions. Over time, veterans argued that the level of recognition did not fully reflect the scale of the battle. Decades later, reviews were conducted. Some awards were upgraded. The debate over honors became part of the Long Tan story itself. Memory also shifted with time. In Vietnam, the battle was remembered differently. It was one of many engagements in a long conflict. The plantation returned to quiet production. The war moved on. In Australia, Long Tan became symbolic. August 18th is now observed as Vietnam Veterans Day. Ceremonies are held, names are read aloud, the story is retold. Historians still study the battle closely. They compare maps and casualty lists. They look at Vietnamese accounts. They piece together what happened step by step. The goal is not to diminish what happened, but to understand it accurately. Long Tan does not require exaggeration to matter. The facts alone are enough. A company-sized unit engaged by a larger force, pinned in open ground during a monsoon storm, holding position through coordinated artillery and relief. The numbers may be debated, the endurance is not. Long Tan did not decide the Vietnam War. It did not shift national strategy. It did not trigger a major change in political policy. In the scale of the conflict, it was a single afternoon in a single province. But it mattered. For the 1st Australian Task Force, the battle confirmed that their doctrine could work. Small units, operating independently, supported by responsive artillery, could survive contact with a larger force. The lesson was not about aggression, it was about control. D Company did not charge forward in waves. They tightened their line. They conserved ammunition. They trusted fire support. That approach prevented panic from spreading through the perimeter. It turned what could have been a collapse into a managed defense. The integration of artillery was central. The performance of 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, demonstrated how closely coordinated fire missions could stabilize a fight that was tilting out of balance. Communication held. Adjustments were precise. The guns bought time until reinforcement arrived. That mattered beyond the plantation. After Long Tan, patrol patterns continued. Operations in Phuoc Tuy province remained focused on pressure, disruption, and intelligence gathering. The battle reinforced confidence in the task force's structure and leadership. For the soldiers who were there, the impact was personal. 18 men did not return from that plantation. Their absence shaped the memory of the unit more than any after-action report. Survivors carried the experience long after the war ended. Over time, Long Tan became a touchstone for Australian veterans of Vietnam. It offered a clear story, a defined place, a defined day, a defined line that held. But the endurance of Long Tan is not built on myth. It rests on measurable facts. A company-sized force was engaged in open ground under severe weather conditions. They faced sustained attacks. They coordinated supporting fire under extreme pressure. They held until relief arrived. There are larger battles in Vietnam's history. There are bloodier ones. But Long Tan remains a study in cohesion under strain, how leadership, training, and communication can keep a unit intact when every external factor is working against it. In the end, the plantation returned to silence. The rubber trees still stand in rows, and the story of that afternoon remains a reminder that sometimes history turns on whether a line holds or breaks. It rained until the light was gone. In a rubber plantation outside a small village, 108 men stood in open ground and refused to give way. They did not know how many were out there. They did not know if help would reach them in time. They held anyway. Long Tan was not a massive offensive. It was not a turning point on a global map. It was a company, a storm, and a perimeter that did not collapse. 18 names never left that plantation. The debate over numbers will continue. Historians will compare reports. Analysts will measure distances and casualty counts. But one fact remains steady. On August 18, 1966, a line was drawn in the rain, and it did not break. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.